She slid the bag labeled "Found" into her trunk because the rain made other people's secrets feel heavier. A soggy photograph slipped out. A man frozen mid-glance, not quite guilty, not quite free. Under the photo, a federal seal burned on the page like a promise and a threat at once. Her phone buzzed, a picture of her own kitchen, the brass key in plain view, and one clean line of type. Stop looking. Suddenly, the people she trusted felt like props in someone else's plan, and every choice smelled of consequence. By dawn, she would have to decide whether to give the truth to those who swore to protect it or keep it and watch everything she loved catch fire. What happened next shocked everyone and set off a chain of events no one saw coming. Stay with me. This is a story you need to hear. Before we start the story, comment below and let us know where in the world you're watching from today. And if you find this story impactful, don't forget to subscribe for more. The rain had a soft, steady voice that night, a thin sheet that made the city blur at the edges and turned lights into smears of gold and white. Rachel Hayes felt the rain like a bruise on her skin as she climbed out of a squad car. The jacket she wore did little to stop the cold that lived in her bones, not weather cold, but the kind that comes from long hours and choices that will not leave you alone. The street smelled of wet asphalt and old cigarette smoke. Far off, a neon sign buzzed. Up close, her breath made a small cloud that vanished fast. Rachel moved with the careful hurry of someone who had learned to hold herself steady in sudden moments. She had been a cop long enough to know how to read a scene by the light of small things. A door left open a crack, shoes turned wrong on a stoop, a child's toy half buried under a trash bag. Tonight, the small things pressed at her mind. Her partner, Daniel Mercer, had joked on the radio earlier about the cafe, down on Third finally getting their act together. Daniel's voice always fit with hers, soft where she was sharp, patient where she was quick to judge. He kept the balance between them. She liked that. She needed that. She saw the bag at the curb before she reached her doorway. It sat under a street lamp like an afterthought, a pale lump wrapped in rain-dark plastic. Someone had slapped a label on it that read, "Found" in rough letters. It looked harmless, ridiculous, even the kind of lost property gesture the city used to pretend order still mattered. Rachel hesitated because her instincts told her to hesitate. A trained hand knows there are small patterns that mean danger. Leaving something that didn't belong could be a test, a trap, or a mercy. She bent, letting her fingers press through the plastic. The bag had weight, but not much. Inside, something shifted like a bird. She could have called it in and walked away. She could have kept to the ordinary list of tasks that let her sleep at the end of a shift. Instead, she opened the trunk of her old sedan and slid the bag inside, closing the lid soft enough to pretend quiet. Little choices broaden into long roads. She told herself she would log it at the station, give it to property, and let someone else make the paper trail. That evening, as cars sloshed past and the rain pieced the world into small moving mirrors, she did not tell herself the truth, that she kept things because she liked to hold details close. It made her feel less at the mercy of events. At home, the apartment smelled like laundry and worn leather. Light from a single lamp feathered across the table where papers lay. A stack of reports, a thin folder with Captain Whitman's neat handwriting on the tab, reminders that authority could also be a kind of weight. Rachel sat and cut open a bag. In the damp light, a photograph lay on top. Michael Turner's face stared back at her from glossy paper, head bowed, hoodie up, hands at his sides. She recognized him from a minor call 2 nights before, a man who had said nothing and watched the street like he kept a secret in his pockets. Under the photograph, folded so tight the creases had teeth, was an envelope. Inside that envelope was a single page stamped with a federal seal she knew too well from training nights, a warrant. The seal ate the light for a moment. Rachel felt the room was narrow. Warrants were tidy things on paper, but terrible in how they moved people. A federal warrant meant stakes not measured in local fines or scoldings. It meant another government, another set of hands, and conversations she could not steer alone. Her thumb found the typed name, and she read it twice to make it a thing she could hold. Michael Turner. Her mouth made no sound. A memory slid through her. The man at Lang Street, the way he had watched her as if he saw the edges of her life. She suddenly felt very small and very heavy at once. The city outside hummed with other lives. Upstairs, the television laughed at an old sitcom. Far away, a child cried and then was soothed. Rachel thought of Captain James Whitman, a mentor who had taught her that law was a line you walked and not a shield you hid behind. He believed in process. He liked things accounted for. He would say, log it, photograph it, hand it over. Do not make yourself a story the press writes. Whitman's voice was in her head now, a steadying echo that joined Daniel's ready jokes and the rain's hush. She poured coffee without thinking. The cup steamed and made a small ring on the counter. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, an unknown number. It could wait. She smoothed the paper of the warrant between her fingers and read the details aloud to the empty kitchen, a habit from long nights when saying a thing made it truer or less dangerous. The warrant listed charges that made her eyes sharpen. It named money moved in the dark, transactions that smelled like someone washing what should not be clean. It gave locations and dates and a thin list of names that made her pulse rise. One address matched Lang Street. Rachel had been trained to separate work from how it touched her. She had practiced neutral faces in interrogation rooms, had learned to fold anger into files and put it on a shelf. But the name Michael Turner did not stay neutral. The sight of his photograph made a memory tilt, a look in his eyes that had not been anger, not exactly, but a kind of recognition. She could not tell if it was toward her or toward something she had not yet understood. Outside, rain made the world a memory itself. Inside, with the warrant in her hands, she realized the city had brought her a quiet hinge. Something was about to open. Whether it would be truth or danger, she could not guess. The choice was no longer merely whether to turn the bag into property. It was whether to step over a line and into a story she might not be able to leave. Rain still tapped the windows like a patient hand. Rachel folded the warrant and smoothed the photograph until the paper murmured. The federal seal had a kind of cold confidence on it, like an accusation in ink. She set it down and stood to wash her hands, as if the act could scrub away the surprise of finding national law on her kitchen table. The apartment felt too small for the idea that someone else, a federal office, some distant process, had reached into her life without knocking. A hard knock at the door startled her. It was not the polite knock of a neighbor or the clumsy knock of a drunk. It was sharp, urgent. Her chest tightened in that familiar way, part alarm and part training. She moved to the peephole and saw Daniel's face, rain-streaked, eyes wide, relief and a new worry met in her throat. Partners arrived in different ways, sometimes with jokes, sometimes with silence. Daniel arrived like a man who had been pulled through something. He stepped inside and closed the door as if the hallway might be listening. He was still damp. His hair clung to his forehead. He spoke first, breath quick. Someone at the property called. They said a bag labeled found came through earlier, but the log, he stopped. He kept his voice low, as if reciting a secret would make it louder. The bag's not in the system. They said it was logged and then gone. Rachel's fingers tightened where they rested on the counter. I have it, she said. The words were small. She could see his mind snap forward, trying to fit that into the story he had been carrying. Daniel's jaw worked. He avoided her eyes for the fraction of a second it takes to measure how far one should go in trust. Why would anyone plant that and then tell property? He asked. Why do that if not to make someone look? He did not finish. He didn't need to. The rest of the sentence hung between them. To make someone look guilty, to start a paper trail that led where someone else wanted. She told him about the photograph first, how Michael Turner's face had stared up at her, flat and small. She told him about the warrant beneath it and the seal that felt heavier than paper. She watched him as she spoke. Daniel's face changed like the weather. He was the kind of person who liked clear maps. When a map had a tear in it, he tightened. He reached for the warrant, as if to check that the thing was real by touch. Then his phone buzzed. He glanced down, and the color drained from his face in a way Rachel had not seen before. He turned the screen so she could see a photograph. Her kitchen, the lamp throwing long light, the bag open on the counter, the warrant's blade where she'd left it. The camera had captured a small brass key on the table, too, its leather fob stamped with initials she knew like a bruise, JW for James Whitman. Someone had taken that picture from across the street or from above or from inside her building. The caption beneath it read a single line that felt like an ice hand. Stop looking. Rachel's stomach clenched. The photo had the terrible intimacy of an office memo. It was both proof and threat. The presence of Captain Whitman's key in the shot tugged at her thoughts. He was a man who believed rules were bridges, not fences. If his mark was in the scene, then what was the connection? Had he been near Michael Turner? Had the captain handled something that now needed covering? Daniel swallowed and looked at Rachel like he was trying to read the skyline through fog. Who would? He began. He did not finish because his phone rang again. This time the caller ID read Federal, no name. He answered it before the second ring finished, the polite professionalism of the station taking over his panic. The voice that spoke was calm, close mic clarity, woman's voice precise. Detective Hayes, she asked, "This is Evelyn Clark, Office of the United States Attorney. I need to speak to you about evidence related to case number 2025 F1189. Where are you now?" Rachel folded in on herself. Evelyn Clark's voice was the opposite of the city's noise. It did not rise or crack, it simply stated, there was an economy there. The name carried weight. Rachel had seen it on training slides and courthouse notices. Federal lawyers rarely called with pleasantries. They called because they needed things controlled. "I'm at home," Rachel said, and heard the smallness of it. She did not explain how or why a warrant signed by a federal judge had come to be in a plastic bag with "found" on it. She did not explain how the bag had been slid into her trunk. She could feel 100 neat procedures pressing at the edges of her life like an authoritative hand. "We need you to surrender any physical evidence in your possession," Evelyn said. "Do not discuss this matter with anyone outside your chain of command. Meet Agent Clark at the U.S. Attorney's office in 30 minutes. Bring the bag. Bring the warrant." There was no question in her voice, only a clear directive. Rachel looked at Daniel. He had not yet moved. In the sparse light, his face showed a play of loyalty and hesitation. "We can go," he said finally. "We can turn it in. Let the feds handle it." His tone was practical, and practicality has always been a type of courage. But in the corner of her eye, Rachel saw the photograph again, the key, the caption, the sense that someone had chosen to tell her to stop. She felt a small familiar burn in her chest, the part of her that had once been a child and had a stubbornness for truth. To hand the warrant over felt like stepping into a hallway with lights out. To keep it felt like walking with a hot coal in her pocket, knowing it would burn, knowing also that sometimes letting it burn reveals what is hidden. Daniel's hand brushed hers, a quick, brotherly squeeze. "Whatever you choose," he said. "I'm with you." His words were steady, but the way his eyes flicked toward the phone when Evelyn spoke, the way his fingers closed too quickly around his coffee mug, small things, but they felt noisy now. Rachel folded the warrant back up. She slid it instead into her jacket pocket under the warmth of her heart. The federal call pinged in her mind like a bell. The photo felt like a probe, and the key with Captain Whitman's initials sat at the folded edge of her thoughts, a quiet suggestion that loyalties might not be where she thought. She left the lamp on and the bag in the trunk. She left the apartment with Daniel at her side, but there was a distance between them that had not been there before. That distance was not only space, it was a question. Someone had looked into her life and left a demand. Stop. Whoever left the note was not merely warning, they were testing. And tests, Rachel knew, rarely stayed private. Rain had a way of making everything softer and more dangerous at once. In the car, Daniel drove with one hand on the wheel and the other rubbing his temple like he could smooth the tension away. The radio was off. The city noise felt too loud in the silence it left. Rachel sat rigid, the warrant pressing a small, secret shape against her chest where she had tucked it. They had agreed to tell Whitman. Captain James Whitman had been a compass for both of them. but now each mile felt like a choice about which compass to trust. "You okay?" Daniel asked finally, voice low. He kept his tone flat, like he had practiced in briefings. "You don't have to." "I know." Rachel looked at him. His face, usually so open, carried something else tonight. A thin worry he did not let himself admit, as if he believed worry made things true. "We should tell him before the feds get him involved in ways he doesn't need." Daniel blinked. If the key in that photo is his, he stopped. Saying Whitman's name with the implication felt like setting a match to paper. "Why would he have a key near your place? He only ever comes by the station." Rachel remembered the first time she'd met Whitman, the way his voice had folded into command without ever needing to shout. He had taught her how to read paperwork like people, how to look at a clause and see the human behind the clause. He had told her once, over burnt coffee and night shift metrics, that law was not a sword but a scalpel, precise, careful. She wanted to believe him, but she could feel the thread of a new doubt twisting through her like a thorn. They found Whitman in his office, the lights low and a map tacked to the wall with pins like a constellation of offenses. He looked older than his years on the map suggested, lines at his eyes, hands that moved slowly now, but his posture still carried the practice of standing up straight no matter what. When Rachel told him about the bag and the warrant and the photograph, his brows drew together and then smoothed, as if he were folding a complicated paper into something manageable. "This is a federal matter," he said, touching the edge of the printed warrant with a finger that trembled a little. "That explains the call. They want control. Not unusual." He paused, and the pause felt like a ledger balancing. "Why would someone leave it with you, Rachel? You don't make the sort of mistakes that put loose ends in your trunk." Rachel felt both exposed and oddly defiant. "I didn't bring it home to hide it," she said. "I brought it home because it felt wrong to leave it. I don't like loose things." Whitman's eyes found hers with a soft, contained pity. "You've always gathered loose things." The words were not accusations, but an old fact about her. "But this could pull threads we don't want pulled." He folded his hands and said something she did not expect. "Do not let it change how you handle the case. Follow procedure. If the feds ask, give them what they need. Do not let curiosity become your case." There was a small ache in Rachel at the warning. She had been trained to follow procedure, and she had also found herself, more than once, following curiosity until the world arranged itself around the truth she wanted. Daniel watched her, and in his face she read a silent calculation: stay close to Whitman, protect the captain, or step away to keep the warrant where it might reveal more. Loyalty felt like a coin that warmed whichever palm held it. Later that night, over stale coffee in the bullpen, the three of them thinned into private corners. Daniel stayed at the window, watching headlights smear like slow tears across wet pavement. "I don't like secrets," he said suddenly, not looking at either of them. "Secrets are what get people hurt." He said it like a confession. "My sister, after she left, all I wanted was a clean record, clean nights." His hands tightened. "If this pulls Whitman in, I don't know if I can." He cut off because what came next was not about Whitman as a mentor, but about Daniel's own fear that his career could be a place of shelter for a family he could not fail again. Rachel's mind returned to Michael Turner. On paper, he was a name tied to finance and transfer routes that smelled like laundering. In person, he had seemed less dangerous and more weary, like a man who had been carrying weather too long. She felt a strange kinship with him, the kind that formed between people who had been watched by the world and found the watching more exhausting than the shame. Her compassion irritated her. She had learned to keep it folded, but it also made her honest. "If he's being framed," she said slowly, "then whichever way the tide runs, someone wanted us to follow it." The next day, Evelyn Clark arrived at the station, sharp, professional, precise in a way that made room for no small comforts. She had the look of someone who had learned how to be emotionless about emotion, so she could steer the ship without being rocked. Her questions were clinical, her tone left no room for misreadings. Underneath her composed exterior, however, Rachel saw a flicker of something like worry when Michael Turner's photograph was mentioned. It was the kind of worry that had nothing to do with courtrooms and everything to do with consequences. You must understand, Evelyn told the small group, federal investigations require a chain of custody. Evidence needs to be accounted for. She looked at Rachel with an intensity that was almost gentle. We're asking because we need to build a case that holds up. If there are irregularities, they undermine everything: victims, witnesses, prosecutions. She paused as if to let the gravity settle. We protect people by protecting the process. That sentence landed differently with each of them. Whitman nodded, because procedure was his religion. Daniel relaxed his hair, clinging to the idea of protection. Rachel's empathy bristled. She had seen processes fail people when they were treated as files instead of lives. But she also knew that without order, nothing stood. The tug between human truth and institutional truth pulled at her like a seam. At night, alone in her apartment, Rachel unfolded the photograph of Michael Turner again. She traced the shadows under his eyes with the tip of her thumb like a ritual. She thought of Daniel's confession about his sister, Whitman's quiet warnings, Evelyn's professional calm. Each person was a vector pulling her in another direction. Loyalties, she realized, were not just to people but to ideals: justice, safety, truth. The cruel part was that those ideals did not always point the same way. She slept poorly, and in sleep she had a small recurring dream. She was walking down Lang Street, and people watched her from windows, whispering not about her actions but about her choices. Waking felt like stepping into a story already written by other hands. In the morning, she chose to keep the warrant hidden a little longer, not out of defiance this time, but to buy herself a margin, a small hour of thinking before the current decided her fate. Rachel could not sleep. The city had folded itself into the soft, guilty dark that makes small sins feel bigger in the hush. She kept replaying the photograph of her kitchen, the brass key with JW pressed into the leather, the caption that said "Stop looking." Each time she looked, the photograph moved from being proof to a question with teeth. Someone with access had taken it. Someone who knew the layout of her life. She drove back to the station before dawn, the dashboard clock bright as an accusation. The lot was empty except for her squad and the streetlights pooling in the wet. Inside, the bullpen smelled like burnt coffee and old paper. She moved through the sleeping bodies of other officers, the kitchen light throwing long shapes on the linoleum. Whitman's door was ajar. The map on his wall looked like a distant constellation. She told herself she wasn't breaking rules when she slipped into the records room. She told herself she needed only a few minutes. The property logs sat in a file cabinet like a confession drawer. Rachel pulled drawers and scanned names and times. A tidy chain of custody until a thin line of ink changed it. Someone had stamped a bag found at 1:17 a.m. The stamp carried Whitman's badge number in the initials field. Her chest felt small. She took a breath and went to the evidence locker terminal, fingers moving as if they had their own memory. The locker camera feeds were supposed to be secure, recorded, archived, untouchable. But technology had holes the same way people did. She found the feed clipped and labeled as routine maintenance. The file was short and grainy at the edges. She watched anyway. At 1:12 a.m., a shape stepped into frame. Whitman's shoulders, the way his coat fell at the back, the slight stoop he had when he was thinking. He used his key to open the locker. He placed a black plastic bag inside a compartment labeled "Misc Found," then closed the door. He did not look at the camera. On the feed, his hand lingered on the locker like someone laying down a weight. At 2:03 a.m., the feed picked up again. Whitman returned, this time leaving the locker and taking nothing visible. Then the clip ended. A cold certainty threaded through Rachel. Someone with access to the locker, someone respected and trusted, had put the bag into the public chain and made sure it would be logged. Someone had made a breadcrumb trail. The image of Whitman's key on her kitchen counter was no longer a curious coincidence. It was a signature. She left the records room with the clip saved to an encrypted folder on a thumb drive and the taste of iron in her mouth. She went straight to Daniel's desk. He was awake now, the screen of his computer blue. In the dim, a half-drunk cup of coffee cooling at his elbow. For a moment, she watched him like a stranger, counting small things she used to think were proof of steadiness. The way he cracked his knuckles, the way he hummed when he filed reports. "Did you know?" she asked without preamble, the thumb drive-heavy in her palm. He looked up too fast. The look on his face when she said the word was not shocking. It was a mix of fear and something like relief. Daniel swallowed. "No, what?" His voice tried for normal, missed by a thin margin. She handed him the file name. He did not open it right away. He waited as if listening for the station walls to decide whether to be betrayers too. "You found it," he said, finally. He exhaled like someone who had been holding their breath for months. Rachel did not ask yet. She listened to the sound of his breath and the whisper of the building's HVAC and remembered the night he had admitted to fearing failure for his sister. She waited because she wanted truth clean, not softened by rationales. He put the clip on, and they watched Whitman's shoulders move in the grainy light. Daniel's jaw worked. He did not look at Rachel when Whitman's hand closed the locker. "It was supposed to be temporary," Daniel said at last. The words came out small, like a child confessing. "He told me it would be temporary." "Tell you what?" Rachel's voice was a flat thing. She was trying to smother the rising heat that felt like betrayal. She had always thought of Whitman as a scaffold, not a pitfall. Daniel's eyes found hers then, and in them she saw something she had not seen before. A man who looked written on by fear. "He asked me to keep an eye on things. Said it was delicate. Said he would take care of it." His hands trembled as he made the shape of a circle in the air. "No consequence. Closed. I thought it was paperwork. He said it had to be moved and logged without fuss. He told me if I did this, if I helped, he'd make sure my sister's name wouldn't come up in an investigation tied to her boyfriend. He said she'd get her chance to keep working instead of having her name dragged." Rachel heard the edges of a confession fall into place. Daniel had been the hinge between them. The man she trusted had been used as a lever. It explained the way he had flinched at Evelyn's call, the way he had avoided Whitman's name one night at the window. It also made him complicit, even if not willingly. "You let him use you," Rachel said, and the accusation felt small against the magnitude of the truth she held. "I didn't know he would." Daniel's voice broke. "I thought I was protecting my sister. Whitman said he'd handle it. He said he was trying to shield us from something bigger. I believed him." He looked away then, because facing her was too like asking forgiveness he had not earned. The betrayal sat between them like a third person. Whitman, the steady hand, had used his power to move evidence into a path that would lead to someone else, and he had used Daniel as the instrument. The lock clicked somewhere in the station, mundane mechanical sound, but it sounded like the closing of a door on a trust. Rachel felt a fierce cold. Not only that someone she respected had vouched for shadowed things, but that someone she loved as a partner had been pressed into service by that same person. Loyalty had been weaponized. The city she walked in now looked less like a place of law and more like a lattice of favors and threats. She thought of Michael Turner, the man in the photograph whose life had been folded into a federal warrant, and of Evelyn Clark's clinical voice. If Whitman could place a bag into the chain, if he could make property logs say what he wanted them to say, then the warrant was not only about Turner's alleged crimes. It could be about protecting people who wanted those crimes to look a certain way. Daniel's shoulders slumped. "I'm sorry," he said. Not a defense, not an excuse. A small, human thing that meant more than he knew. Outside, dawn was finding the edges of the city. Inside, Rachel realized that the ground beneath her career had shifted. The map was no longer a constellation of offenses. It was a territory with concealed lines. Trust had been rearranged. The first twist had uncoiled like a wire, and its electricity hummed a dangerous promise. Nothing would be simple again. The station felt smaller after dawn, like a room that had been rearranged while everyone slept. Rumors moved faster than coffee. Word had already slipped through the bullpen that the feds were pressing hard, and that Whitman, Captain James Whitman, wasn't looking like the unshakable man they all thought he was. The map on his wall looked more like a crime scene than a plan. Rachel sat at her desk while the building breathed around her. Her hands were steady, but her heart was not. Daniel hovered nearby, pretending he was filing a report, but listening as if each line might give away the next step. The thumb drive with the locker footage rested under a loose stack of forms, a secret small enough to fit in a pocket and large enough to change lives. Then came the call that made the air go thin, Evelyn Clark. Her voice was softer now, but it cut through routine like a blade. "We have Turner in custody," she said. "He was picked up in a safe house across state lines last night. He's being held for conspiracy and financial fraud connected to an interstate laundering scheme." Rachel felt numb. Turner in custody. The federal stamp on the warrant suddenly had teeth. "But there's a problem," Evelyn continued. "The chain of custody on evidence linked to his arrest is inconsistent. We need to know exactly where that bag you reported came from, Detective Hayes. Any irregularity could jeopardize this prosecution." The last part landed like a verdict. If the chain is broken, Mr. Turner may be released. We can't risk that. Rachel looked at Daniel, searching his face, needing to see whether the confession from last night had softened or sharpened him. He looked smaller, like a man who had been used as a bandage and now felt the tear. "We'll cooperate," he said. His voice trembled on the last word. That afternoon, Internal Affairs sent a thin man with neat shoes and an exhausted smile. He asked Rachel to recount everything she had done with the bag, the warrant, and the photograph. He asked the same questions Whitman had asked, but with a different cold. No pity, only files. Rachel answered truthfully and then watched as the man's pen moved. When he left, the bullpen felt 10 degrees colder. News traveled down the chain. By evening, someone had posted a grainy screenshot from the locker camera outside the break room. It was captioned with more salt than warning, "When the people who protect laws protect secrets instead." People whispered, "Trust is a brittle thing. Gossip is the pebble that breaks it." Whitman called Rachel at dusk. He sounded older than his years, and for the first time in all the nights she had known him, he did not have an immediate answer for everything. "Rachel," he said, "I need you to listen." He asked her to come by his house. He asked it like a man who wanted to keep a conversation off record. She went because she did not know how to refuse the man who had once shaped her instincts. He lived in a tidy house with a garden that smelled faintly of rosemary. Up close, Whitman looked like someone built of small favors and worn habits. He sat her down and took her hands with a steadiness that registered as pleading. "There's a line out there that I crossed," he said. "I thought I was protecting someone who needed saving. I thought I was choosing the lesser wrong." He looked at her, and she could see the tired arithmetic in his eyes. "I tried to keep it quiet so nobody else would be hurt." "You put evidence into the system," Rachel said. The words felt blunt and clean. They were the law's language. "You used the locker. You put the bag where it would be logged." "I did," he said, "because if it stayed outside, people would be killed. There are men in this city who don't care about paperwork. They care about outcomes." He swallowed. "I thought I could control it. I thought I could protect both the process and people. I was wrong." Rachel listened and felt the thin paper between right and wrong shiver. Whitman's answer did not make things simpler, it made them denser. If his story was true, then someone else, someone dangerous, was at play. If it was false, then he had chosen to bend the system for reasons he would not reveal. Either way, the choice he had made had pulled Daniel into the current. Daniel's confession replayed in Rachel's head like a broken record. "I thought I was protecting my sister." She pictured his sister, a woman who needed work and another chance, and felt a soft stab of empathy and anger. How do you punish a man trying to keep his family whole without shattering the family he hoped to save? That night, Rachel found an anonymous note tucked beneath her windshield wiper when she stepped out of the building. The paper was plain. The message was not, "We see you." The handwriting was careful, as if the person who wrote it wanted their threat to sound bureaucratic. She folded it into her pocket and felt the weight of eyes in places she could not see. Her internal world clenched. Every route forward now carried danger. Hand the evidence to the feds and risk Whitman's ruin and Daniel's family being exposed. Keep the evidence and try to investigate on her own, risking obstruction, career death, and maybe the release of a man who might be dangerous. The ethical map had no clean path. compounding the danger, Evelyn called again and said plainly that if the chain of custody could not be verified, they would have to consider the possibility that someone inside the department was interfering. "We will have to widen our scope," she warned. "If that happens, every person who has access to evidence will be scrutinized." The news felt like a tightening noose. Rachel pictured the federal rooms she had only seen on training slides, the harsh lights, the long tables of evidence, the slow unbending of law. She also pictured Michael Turner in a small cell, eyes hollowed by worry and accusation. She tried to imagine what justice would look like if it were stripped of context and the truth. It looked like an empty room and names filed away. In the small hours, she sat at her kitchen table with the warrant spread like a map. Daniel slept on the couch in her apartment. He had come over and stayed because neither of them wanted to be alone with the threats. She watched him breathe and thought of the thinness of loyalty and the weight of betrayal. She realized that the next step would define not just a career, but the shape of the people she loved. She made a decision that tasted bitter. She copied the locker footage to another secure drive and hid that drive where only she could reach it. She would not hand everything over blindly. She would not lie. But she would not be used as an instrument of cover-up either. If anyone wanted to break the chain of custody to save power or to destroy a life, she would find who else was moving the pieces. The plan had no guarantees. It carried the risk of exposing her to both sides. The feds if she was seen as withholding, Whitman and Daniel if she was seen as betrayal. It carried the cost of sleepless nights and an ache that felt like the first day a leg is broken, sharp and changing. Outside, rain began again, soft at first and then harder, as if the city wanted to scrub itself clean. Inside, Rachel folded the photograph of Michael Turner and put it beside the warrant. She did not yet know which loyalties she would preserve or which she would break. She only knew the line she would not cross. She would not let fear alone decide the fate of a man who might be guilty or who might be innocent. The consequences of that choice would come crashing in sooner than she wanted. They chose the conference room at the U.S. Attorney's office because it had glass walls and a light that made everyone feel watched. Rachel sat at the long table with the thumb drive under her palm like a hot stone. Across from her, Evelyn Clark wore a suit that declared authority in clean lines. Whitman's face had gone pale. Daniel's hands would not stop moving. Michael Turner sat in a chair at the end of the table, wrists unclasped, eyes that had learned to look small to survive. The room smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and old paper. Outside, the city moved on uncaring. Rachel felt the weight of the day in her bones. She had rehearsed what she would say 100 times in the dark and at the kitchen sink. Words were easier when they were written. Spoken, they could become weapons or apologies. She placed the drive into the laptop and watched the little blue light blink awake. The screen flashed and a grainy image filled the wall-sized monitor, the locker camera, the exact clip she had copied. Whitman's shoulders entered the frame. The same motion he made that late night open the locker. On the screen, his hand rested on the compartment. The image felt unbearable in its ordinariness. It showed openness, not conspiracy, until Rachel clicked play on the second file. The second clip was longer. It began earlier and stretched further than the maintenance label allowed. The feed showed not only Whitman, but a shadowed figure moving with care, Evelyn Clark. She bent, opened the locker, and for a moment held the bag as if measuring it. Her mouth moved. The camera picked up no clear audio, but the timing on the file carried metadata. Upload originating from an IP address traced to a secure terminal in the U.S. Attorney's office. Rachel had spent nights learning how to read that kind of data. It had cost her hours of headaches and a small lie to a technician. Now, it made a clean line from the screen to the woman sitting across from her. Evelyn's eyes narrowed, a slow, clinical thing. Her voice, when it came, was thin with control. "How did you get access to that feed?" she asked. There was no surprise in her tone, only the cold assessment of damage. Rachel thought of Daniel's trembling hands, of Whitman's apology waiting like a small stone in his throat. She thought of Michael Turner's face in the photograph, of the warrant folded like an accusation. She listened to the humming of the air conditioner and then spoke in a voice that did not want to be loud and yet could not be small. "You logged into the system," she said. "You put the bag into the chain and you arranged things so Turner would be the man in the middle." Her words landed like thin knives. "We have the metadata that shows the upload originated from your terminal." Across the table, Evelyn's control cracked a breath. "We were coordinating with multiple agencies," she said. "Sometimes evidence moves in ways the public can't see. This was operational." The claim smelled of practiced answers. Her eyes flicked to Whitman, then to Daniel, as if cataloging loyalties. Whitman's voice came then, raw and small. "I thought it was a controlled transfer," he said. "I thought." He broke off, placing his palm flat on the table like a man trying to steady himself. "I was trying to shield people who would otherwise be endangered. I was wrong." His admission fell between them and made the room colder still. The confession did not excuse what he did. It only deepened the moral tangle. Daniel's shoulders shook as if from the cold. He had played the role of protector for his sister with such desperation that he had swallowed orders without seeing the teeth. Now that desperation had a face, the woman at the end of the table with eyes that would not soften. He looked up and met Rachel's gaze. In the hollow of his face, she saw shame and the raw need to be forgiven. Michael Turner's voice surprised them all because it had been quiet up until then. He had been forced into a position that made him smaller than any of the paper could show. "I wasn't the mastermind," he said. His words came slow and steady, like a man taking the first step out of a shallow water he had been standing in. "I was a cog. I was paid to move money. I got scared, and I tried to talk to the feds. They told me I would be protected. But then the protection became a press release and a badge." He looked straight at Evelyn then. "You promised me safety in exchange for my testimony. Then you switched the terms." Evelyn's face gave nothing. The mask of the prosecutor had been perfected. She told them all about larger cases, about the risk of letting organized money slip through fingers while chasing small men. She used words like national interest and operational necessity. But the metadata and the second clip and Turner's quiet clarity did what words could not. They made a picture. Outside the glass, someone moved, a janitor passed by, and looked in. Inside, the room felt like a stage. Evelyn had been confident in a system that believed in its own sanctity. Rachel watched the scene show. She had expected a courtroom battle. Instead, she watched the human calculus collapse under proof. People who ate their words when Safe Now had to swallow what they had said. When the U.S. Attorney's internal oversight agent arrived, someone Rachel had insisted be called, their nod was small but official. They read lines about chain of custody and misuse of office. They spoke about consequences. Evelyn tried to frame it as necessary improvisation. Her argument carried with it the weight of those who believe ends justify means. But the footage and the metadata were patient. They did not care for arguments that were not backed by logs and timestamps. As the agent reached for Evelyn's badge, the room tilted. Whitman stood up. His legs were steady in motion, but his voice shook. "If I had known that my action would be used to set an innocent man in front of a federal case," he said, "I would have come to you differently. I would have told the truth." He looked at Daniel then, and the look was a request for a mercy that could no longer be given. Daniel dropped his head and wept, a short sound that made everyone hold a breath. His apology floated in the glass room like a thing that could not be taken back. He had tried to save a family and had helped stitch a man's ruin into an official file. Michael Turner watched them with a tired sort of clarity. "I didn't ask to see the story," he said. "I got pulled into someone else's book." By the time the agent left with Evelyn in handcuffs, the room had the tired hush of a place after a storm. Cameras had been called, statements taken. The feds had to decide what to do with Turner, with Whitman, with the evidence now poisoned by choices that tried to be noble and became selfish. For Rachel, the moment was not victory. It was a clearing. Truth had surfaced, sharp and uncompromising. People would be hurt. Some would be held to account. Others would find the world colder because the scaffolds they trusted could be used to hide things. Rachel felt both the relief and the cost. She thought of the nights she had carried small things home to keep her life neat. She had wanted justice in its clean form, but justice had come messy, messy as human hands. Standing there with the monitors glow still on their faces, she understood that truth might free some and break others, and that sometimes the two were the same act. The room emptied slowly, the hum of the air conditioning and the quiet clicks of shoes, the only sounds left after statements and handshakes and the careful paperwork that follows a storm. Rachel walked out into the late afternoon with a hollow where certainty used to live. The city had not changed. The same buses hissed at stops, the same shop signs blinked, but she felt the seams of it more clearly. Where once she had seen lines of law and order, she now saw the hands that drew those lines, sometimes steady, sometimes shaking. Michael Turner was moved to a different holding facility while prosecutors and oversight agents reassessed his case. The charges did not dissolve overnight. Federal prosecutors still had a file of papers and numbers and people whose lives had been touched by money. But the taint of tampered evidence forced a reckoning. Michael's defense team argued the chain of custody had been corrupted. A judge ordered a review. It was not the simple vindication Rachel had once hoped for. It was a slow, practical undoing, one that allowed Michael a chance to tell more of the truth, which in turn began to reshape how the case looked on paper and in the press. Evelyn Clark faced internal charges and a preliminary hearing. What had been framed as operational necessity was now called by its fuller name, misuse of power. The U.S. Attorney's Office moved with a cautious hand, anxious about precedent and reputation. Evelyn's arrest made headlines for a day and a half, enough for the phone calls and the late evening commentary. She sat in a different room now, not as a captain of procedure, but as a defendant in a system she once personified. Pride and pragmatism met her in equal measure. She had been certain the ends justified the means. It hurt her, perhaps more than any formal sanction, to see principles she had leaned on bend under the weight of ordinary harm. Whitman resigned before formal discipline could be completed. He wrote a short letter, no fanfare, that said only what he could not say aloud otherwise. He had acted to protect people he thought would be harmed by exposure, and in doing so he had broken the very trust he was sworn to uphold. For him, the resignation was both a confession and a small attempt at repair. It did not erase his mistake, but it acknowledged it. Daniel's sister kept her job, but the cost was a new plainness between siblings, no more favors hidden in dark folders, no more promises made on the hush of a corridor. Daniel took a leave of absence to care for her and to think. It was not punishment in the way the public thought of punishment, it was consequence shaped into care. Rachel watched those outcomes fold into the city like new, sharp-edged maps. She did not feel triumphant. She felt threadbare and steadier at once. A person who had learned that justice is not a single clear river, but a braided set of streams, some muddy, some clear, all running together. In the quiet that came after the storm, she found herself returning, again and again, to the small things that had started it all. The photograph, the brass key, the bag with the found label. They were like talismans she could not throw away, because they insisted on memory. One late evening, she met Michael in a room with a thin window and a coffee machine that made better promises than it kept. He looked older than his paper suggested, as if the worry in him had carved small lines across his face. They spoke without lawyers for the first time. He told her, simply and without theatricality, about how choices had been presented to him. A door opened with promises, a map drawn with gaps, the hard edge of fear when one is asked to do things for survival. He did not ask for pity. He asked only for fairness. I did wrong, he said, not to excuse but to own. But I was small in a system that hides big men. I was useful to people who could give me safety for a moment and then make me the story when it fit them. I don't know if I'll be free, Rachel, but I want the truth told right. Rachel listened, and for the first time in the months since the bag appeared, let the anger that had sharpened into mission soften into something like sorrow. There was no clean ending where everyone stood heroic. There was only the slow, stubborn work of making things less broken than they were. At home, she kept Whitman's brass key in a little dish on her kitchen counter. It was a small object, worn leather, initials pressed into it, yet it carried the weight of choices. Sometimes she turned it in her fingers and thought of Whitman's voice when he had said he'd chosen a lesser wrong. Sometimes she touched the initials and felt a pulse of disappointment. Mostly she used it as a reminder that people who teach law are human too. They can love justice and still make terrible mistakes. There were nights she could not sleep when she pictured the ledger of choices in people's lives and wondered where she had fit in it. She had kept evidence from the feds for a while, hidden a clip in a drawer, and those hours felt like a test she had passed and failed at the same time. She had acted to protect truth, but in protecting truth, she also broke rules that were meant to hold things steady. The paradox sat with her like a familiar ache. In the months that followed, the department changed in modest ways. There were new audits, small reorganizations, a training seminar about evidence handling that seemed designed as both instruction and apology. People came and went. Life, as it always does, rearranged itself around new facts and fresh loyalties. Daniel returned to work with a quieter manner and a clearer purpose. His sister's future steadied. Whitman, removed from uniform, visited the station one afternoon to hand over a box of files and to say a brief goodbye. He looked at Rachel with more humility than she had seen in his face before. She did not embrace him. She nodded, and that small recognition was both a wound and a stitch. On an empty night, she walked Lang Street alone, the place where she had first seen Michael in a hoodie, the place where the bag had lay like a small white lie. Rain came down in a slow, gentle way, as if the city rinsed itself after each mess. She thought about choices again, about the ways people try to hold one another safe, and the ways those same attempts can hurt. She felt tired and oddly lighter. Justice, she decided, is less a destination than a continuous tending. It requires naming mistakes, facing them, and doing better the next time. It requires mercy for those who erred with fear in their hands, and firmness for those who use power to bend truth into an instrument. It demands patience because people are not perfect sheets of paper, they are edges and folds, and sometimes bad maps rewritten. Rachel slid Whitman's key into her pocket before she turned for home. It would sit there for a while, a small weight against her thigh, a reminder of the brittle human work of law. She would keep tending the sort of justice she believed in, messy, costly, and real, because the city did not owe her neat endings. It only offered chances to do better, and that, in the end, felt like enough. If you found this story powerful, make sure to hit that like button, share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more videos like this. Your support helps us bring more important stories to light.